They laughed when they boxed her in, boots scraping wet asphalt, voices too loud for a place that suddenly felt very small, until one of them caught the flash of a patch on her jacket and went quiet, eyes widening as if the night itself had whispered a warning. "Woman in the wind." He breathed, and everything changed. Stay with this story to the very end, because what happens next turns fear into power, and if stories about courage, sisterhood, and standing your ground move you, like the video and subscribe to the channel right now. Nia cut the engine and let the silence settle, rainwater dripping from the neon sign above the roadside diner, her helmet still warm from miles of open road, and thoughts she hadn't shared with anyone. Being a black biker girl had taught her to read rooms the way she read curves at speed, watch the shoulders, the hands, the exits. The circle tightened anyway, a practiced cruelty. Jokes meant to test how much space she would surrender. She didn't. She stood with her weight balanced, fingers loose at her sides, eyes steady, because fear had never been a stranger and she'd learned it fed bullies faster than anger ever could. One of them leaned too close, breath sour with bravado, talking about who belonged where, about bikes and bodies and rules made small enough to fit their minds. Nia felt the old memories flicker. Being told the road wasn't for girls like her, being warned she'd regret claiming a life that required nerve and patience, being dared to quit. She'd ridden through heat that burned resolve down to bone, and through nights that tried to steal it back. And she'd learned that belonging wasn't granted, it was earned mile by mile. When a hand drifted toward her bike, crossing a line that didn't need words, she turned just enough for the patch to catch the light, stitched letters glowing against worn leather like a promise kept. The laughter thinned. Someone swallowed. Another shifted his feet, as if recalculating the math of consequences. The name carried weight even for those who only half knew it. Women in the Wind wasn't just a club. It was a lineage, a rule book written in miles and scars, a sisterhood that taught you how to stand without shouting and how to leave without begging. Nia spoke then, calm and measured, naming boundaries the way you name facts, not daring them to cross but making it clear where the line lived. The men tried to laugh it off, but the sound cracked. Eyes flicked to the highway, to the darkness beyond the lights, to the possibility that this moment wasn't as isolated as they'd hoped. Engines murmured somewhere far off, close enough to unsettle, and the night seemed to listen. Nia breathed slow, feeling the road hum up through her boots, remembering the first long ride when older women flanked her like quiet sentinels, teaching her how to wrench and ride and read a room, how fear was information and respect could be demanded without fists. Another insult landed and slid off, weightless. She didn't threaten. She didn't boast. She simply existed, undeniable, and that unsettled them most of all. When she shifted her stance and the patch caught the light again, the circle loosened, confidence leaking away, and in that pause Nia felt every mile she'd ridden settle into her spine, a steadying hand she could trust. The name lingered in the damp air long after the laughter faded, and Nia felt it settle like a shield she didn't need to raise, because Women in the Wind was never about intimidation. It was about presence, about knowing who you were even when the room tried to tell you otherwise. She remembered the first time she'd heard the engines approach her on a lonely stretch of highway months ago, a low chorus that had steadied her hands before she ever saw their headlights, and how the women rode in formation without crowding her, giving space and support in equal measure. They'd taught her that the road respected calm more than bravado, that balance came from preparation, and that sisterhood meant showing up without asking to be thanked. Now, in the slick glow of the diner lights, she watched the men recalibrate, their confidence unraveling thread by thread as they realized this wasn't a lone rider they could push around and forget. One of them scoffed, trying to reclaim the moment with a joke that fell flat, and another muttered that it was just a misunderstanding. But the words sounded rehearsed, like excuses practiced too late. Nia kept her voice level and her posture open, because escalation was a choice she didn't need to make. She named the simple truth that everyone deserved to go home unbothered, that touching another person's bike without permission crossed a line, and that the night didn't owe anyone an audience for cruelty. The rain began again in a thin, needling drizzle, tapping helmets and jackets like punctuation, and the lot smelled of oil and wet concrete, familiar and grounding. She felt the quiet hum of readiness in her muscles, not for a fight, but for departure, because movement had always been her safest answer. The men shifted their weight, boots scraping, eyes darting toward the road where trucks hissed past, and Naya recognized the moment when bullies realized they're being watched by more than just the person in front of them. By consequence, by memory, by witnesses they can't see. She thought of the rides that earned her trust within the wind, the long days when the sun pressed hard, and the miles asked questions about endurance, the nights by small fires where stories were shared without embellishment, where mistakes were owned and lessons passed hand to hand. Those women had taught her how to leave a place better than she found it, or at least quieter, and how to choose dignity even when adrenaline begged for spectacle. One man stepped back, then another, a ripple of retreat masked as indifference, and Naya allowed it, offering an exit without chasing their pride, because victory didn't need an audience. She turned toward her bike with deliberate ease, fingers brushing the tank in a familiar ritual that anchored her breath, and when a voice cracked behind her asking if she thought she was better than them, she paused only long enough to answer that she thought everyone could be better than this. The silence that followed was thick and instructive, a lesson settling where insults had failed. Nia swung into the saddle, checked her mirrors, and felt the weight of the moment lift as the engine came alive, a steady thrum that spoke of distance and choice. As she rolled forward, not rushing, not performing, the patch on her back caught the light one last time, not as a threat but as a reminder that belonging, once earned, traveled with you wherever the road led. The road did not open immediately when Nia left the diner lot. Instead, it narrowed into a stretch of darkness that felt intentional, as if the night wanted to see whether courage would hold once the witnesses disappeared. And she rode into it with the steady patience the wind had taught her, letting the engine's rhythm calm the echoes still buzzing in her chest. She did not look back, not because she wasn't aware of the men behind her fading into memory, but because forward motion had always been her way of choosing herself, and the asphalt unspooled beneath her tires like a promise she intended to keep. As the miles slipped by, the incident replayed in fragments, boots scraping, laughter cracking, the hush when the patch caught, the light, and she felt the familiar mix of anger and relief that followed moments where the world tried to test her boundaries. Being a black woman on a bike meant carrying a heightened awareness everywhere, a constant calculation of risk and resilience, and some nights that weight pressed heavier than others. Tonight, though something different settled in alongside it, a quiet pride not rooted in confrontation but in restraint, in the knowledge that she had stood her ground without surrendering her values. She thought of the first woman who had noticed her at a gas station months ago, the nod that came before the questions, the shared smile that said "I see you" without demanding proof, and how that nod had led to a ride, and that ride to a trial, and that trial to a patch she wore not as decoration but as responsibility. Women in the wind had never promised safety from the world's ugliness. They promised preparation, community, and the courage to respond without becoming what threatened you. The highway curved, the stars thinning as clouds gathered again, and Naya adjusted her speed, trusting the road, trusting herself. Somewhere ahead, headlights bloomed and passed, anonymous lives intersecting for seconds before diverging forever, and she felt the comfort of being one rider among many, connected by nothing more than momentum and respect. Her thoughts drifted to the stories shared around roadside fires and kitchen tables, stories of rides gone wrong and hands reached out in time, of women who'd been underestimated until they weren't, of lessons learned the hard way, and passed on so others wouldn't have to bleed for them. Those stories had shaped her as much as the miles had, giving her language for feelings she'd carried alone for years, reminding her that strength didn't cancel vulnerability but made room for it. The rain returned in earnest, a steady sheet that softened the world's edges, and Naya leaned into it, posture loose, breath even, letting the water wash away the last of the diner's neon glare. She exited toward a familiar stretch where the wind sometimes regrouped. Not because she needed backup now, but because ritual mattered, because checking in mattered, because sisterhood thrived on intention. When she rolled into the overlook, a handful of bikes were already there, engines ticking as they cooled, riders silhouetted against the low glow of the city. No one rushed her. No one demanded an explanation. A helmet lifted, a hand raised, space opened. She parked and dismounted, feeling the night settle into something welcoming, and when she finally spoke, it was to share the facts without embellishment, trusting the circle to understand the rest. They listened the way they always did, fully, without interruption. And when she finished, there was no outrage, no call for revenge, only nods and a few well-placed questions about how she felt now, what she wanted next. That was the Wind's Wade agency first, spectacle never. Someone handed her a thermos, another adjusted a light that had shifted in the rain, small acts that spoke louder than speeches. Naya realized then that the freeze she'd seen in the Bullies' eyes wasn't just fear of a name, it was fear of a network, of accountability, of women who rode with purpose and memory and didn't disappear when challenged. As the group dispersed, each rider choosing her own route home, Nia lingered a moment longer, watching taillights thread into darkness, feeling the deep calm that came after choosing dignity. She mounted up again, the engines hum a familiar comfort, and headed out, knowing that tomorrow the world would still be imperfect and sometimes hostile, but also knowing she would meet it with the tools she'd earned. Awareness, patience, and a sisterhood that rode with her, whether they were visible or not. Morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of pale grey dawn that doesn't demand attention, but rewards those awake enough to notice it. And Nia rode straight into it, the road still damp, the air cool enough to sharpen every breath, carrying with her the quiet aftershock of the night before. The confrontation no longer played in her mind as a threat, but as a lesson, rearranged into something steadier, something she could live with, and as the miles unfolded she realized that this was how growth usually announced itself. Not loudly, not with applause, but with a sense of balance settling where tension used to live. She passed empty fields and shuttered gas stations, places that looked forgotten until you learned their stories, and she thought about how often she'd felt the same way in rooms where no one expected her to belong. Riding had changed that slowly, teaching her that belonging wasn't a permission slip handed out by strangers, but a relationship built through commitment, discipline, and showing up again and again, even when the road tested you. She remembered the first long ride she'd taken with women in the wind, how her hands had cramped and her shoulders burned, how she'd worried she was slowing everyone down, and how no one rushed her or shamed her for needing a break. They'd simply adjusted formation, taught her how to pace herself, how to read the signs her body gave before exhaustion turned dangerous. That patience had stayed with her, shaping how she handled moments like the one at the diner, choosing restraint not because she was afraid, but because she was confident enough to refuse chaos. As the sun rose higher, burning off the last of the mist, Nia pulled over at a wide overlook where the land opened up and in all directions killed the engine, and let the silence stretch, realizing how rare it was to feel both alone and supported at the same time. She leaned against her bike and watched the light change the color of the world, thinking about how Bullies froze not because of a patch alone, but because the patch represented continuity, accountability, and a refusal to disappear quietly. They froze because they sensed history at her back, not the kind written in books, but the kind lived and remembered, passed down through shared miles and hard-earned trust. Naya understood now that being with women in the wind didn't mean backup would always arrive in a roar of engines. Sometimes it meant carrying their teachings so fully that you didn't need anyone else present to stand your ground. She thought about younger riders she'd met recently, women still learning how to take up space without apology, and felt a responsibility settle gently but firmly in her chest, the same way it had when she first earned her patch. The road had given her confidence, but the sisterhood had given her purpose, and together they formed something durable enough to withstand moments of cruelty without hardening her heart. She mounted up again and rode through the late morning, stopping for fuel and coffee, exchanging nods with other riders who understood the unspoken language of the road, feeling connected without explanation. Each mile reinforced the truth that the world would continue to test her, sometimes subtly, sometimes bluntly, but she would meet it with clarity instead of fear, choosing dignity even when no one was watching. By afternoon, the heat rose and traffic thickened, and Nia navigated it with the same calm precision she'd learned on long rides, aware that confidence didn't mean recklessness and freedom didn't mean ignoring risk. When she finally turned toward home, the city skyline shimmering ahead, she felt complete in a way she hadn't before, not because the world had suddenly become safe, but because she trusted herself to move through it. The memory of the bullies had lost its sting, transformed into a reminder of how far she'd come, and as she parked and shut down the engine, she rested her helmet on the seat and smiled, knowing that strength could be quiet and still reshape a moment. Being a black biker girl, being a woman in the wind, meant carrying layers of identity that the world sometimes tried to flatten. But it also meant riding with intention, legacy, and the certainty that she did not stand alone, even when she stood by herself. And if this story inspired you, moved you, or reminded you of the power that comes from knowing exactly who you are and who you ride with, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, emotional stories. Because some journeys don't just change the rider, they change the road behind them forever.